Good morning, everybody, and hello, welcome. Are you there, colleagues?
Hi there, Liz. You're right. Hiya.
Yeah, hello. So, following on from the discussion we had last week about grief, today we're going to talk about being overwhelmed by emotions. And, it's obviously a really big subject, and probably one that we won't, cover it all in today's session. But I thought we'd sort of start by looking at our own emotional responses to the current kind of COVID events and what's going on in the world. And then later on, I want to kind of look at one of the main theories related to managing emotions and being able to kind of deal with them. For a little bit of practical help. So I want to start off with I know what I noticed on lots of social media posts that had no doubt good intentions, but were lots of suggestions that people stay strong. And I was thinking realistically, how helpful is this, and what other emotions? What about the emotions that aren't strong and brave are people experiencing? And so I just wanted to ask the rest of the team kind of if they could come up with some descriptions of the emotions they're experiencing at the moment. And I should probably actually say today, because if it's anything like me, my emotions kind of move from day to day. So yeah, just what are some of the things that people are experiencing at the moment?
So for me, today as well, because as like you said, Liz, it's different every day. Today, I'm feeling a bit angry and just a bit, I don't know sort of what's happening. So I'm feeling a bit angry and a little bit of despair today, but also there's a little calm in there as well, because I'm really aware of all of my emotions all the time. So I'm sort of really aware of how I'm feeling all the time, which is really exhausting as well.
That's kind of, yeah, that's an interesting point about that kind of constantly being in this emotional world and how exhausting that is. Anybody else? What are we going? What are we feeling?
Yeah, I would say it is quite exhausting because you're kind of aware of your emotions, like tapping into them to look after them and keep yourself, trying to look after yourself mentally. But they are just so up and down, I guess. And it's like those things of like being aware of how you feel and being able to kind of do something about them. So like, getting really, really angry about the situation and politics. So maybe not watching the news and stuff like that. But then, you still find out stuff and it's still kind of, yeah, angry is a kind of a big one at the moment. And then kind of realizing I know that my mental health can be really up and down, and we're scared of the down bits, and really having to kind of like dig deep, I like that word, dig deep, to try and do stuff that I wouldn't normally do, just to try and help my mental state, just to kind of like change it a little bit. But it is, knowing that it will change, and it does change, and it changes loads, from day to day, from hour to hour, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that, because I feel like personally, the last week or two, I've had like one overriding emotion, or is it a non-emotion, and it's numbness. So I'm really struggling to feel emotions at the moment. And I find that, like, funny enough, nowadays, I'm so connected and, talking with my friends all the time. And like, I'm struggling to find things to say. Like, talk doesn't come easy to me at the moment. And it's just because I feel like really disconnected, I think, from my emotions. And, in that, like, I'm kind of really struggling to sort of just generally have an authentic conversation with people. And that has just been consistent over this last week. And I feel that, like, you know, having kind of like you know, talking with people and their kind of responses and emotions, I feel like, my God, what's wrong with me? Like, why am I not having those feelings? So that's kind of like where I'm kind of sitting with it at the moment.
I think that's probably incredibly helpful, Bex, for people that aren't, you know, really experiencing you know, there's lots of kind of prescription, isn't there, about, you know, how we should feel and what the common feelings are. And of course, you know, of course, the whole kind of, I mean, the whole subject is that all feelings are valid, and I think part of that is that not feelings are valid as well. So, but you know, I wouldn't be surprised if people listening to this were like, yes, you know, that's really helpful because I'm not feeling anything as well. So, thank you.
Yeah. And but it's one of those things, isn't it, that, you know, there's lots to do, like, you know, what we're doing with the organization right now, there's lots to keep me motivated. I've got my little sewing machine at home, you know, I've got all my little bits and bobs around me to keep me occupied, but it's still like, you know, even with that, I can't connect right now to myself.
I mean,
Yeah, I was gonna just quickly say, I think for me, it's in some ways quite hard to kind of pin down one emotion because they, you know, they change daily, but they also just change so kind of minute to minute sometimes, or like hour to hour.
yeah.
And I can just go from kind of real opposites of just feeling kind of quite optimistic and just thinking about kind of what we can take from this experience, but then other times just feeling really paralyzed by the magnitude of what's going on. So I feel like a lot of the time for me, there's just lots of kind of very conflicting emotions and lots of confusion. Yeah, about how I feel. And I think it's not that, you know, I can kind of, I think I am connecting to the feelings, but I think it's the how rapidly they change. Like I can't even stay in an emotion long enough to kind of process it. It's just like from here to here to here to here. So yeah, confusion.
One of the sorry, Katie, I'm kind of aware you don't, you know, oh, have to, and you, but one of the things that I kind of want to talk about later, one of the theories, it was, you know, is dialectical behavioral therapy that was created for people experiencing that kind of huge, shifting, quick, kind of, you know, waterfall of emotions, or almost, that, you know, that the speed and the way that they can shift, I thought might be kind of helpful in the current situation, because, you know, I'm sure that quite a few people are just experiencing that huge array of emotions. Do you want to say anything, Katie? You would?
Yeah, just quickly, maybe, because what you said there does sound really helpful, and I related to something that Heather said about feeling like I have certain feelings that I'm quite frightened of having. So I think, like, the past few weeks I've been in a lot of anxiety, but in a way that's quite comfortable for me. I sort of feel like I know how to channel anxiety, and what I feel right now is quite a lot of fear about getting hit by sadness. Like, I really want to be busy so that I don't feel this feeling of sadness that I think is lurking somewhere, if that makes sense. So, yeah.
That's really, it makes total sense, and it kind of really nicely and unscripted leads me on to the next thing I wanted to ask you, really, because I think because of the way we work and the people we work with, it's also really helpful to think about, you know, the kind of how emotions were expressed in the households we grew up in. Because if we take, you know, if we sort of take as a sort of given somebody's ideas like John Bowlby, that the emotional patterns we had as very, you know, young children and babies, we kind of continue those patterns as adults. I think, you know, we have to kind of take that as a given. I was kind of interested in the kind of atmosphere, the emotional atmosphere of the homes you grew up in. And I wondered if people were comfortable in saying a little bit more about that. Does that make sense? So what I mean is, for instance, I know that I kind of grew up in a household where people didn't really emotions weren't really expressed, and there were lots of kind of legitimate reasons for that, around kind of bereavement and poverty and things like that were very real. But at a really early age, I understood that my mother was, struggling quite a lot and not coping too well, and that having emotions would be like an inconvenience. And as an adult, I can kind of see that I struggle to express emotions if I feel like they're going to inconvenience somebody or cause a fuss, which is logically doesn't make a lot of sense, but that there is still that reticence on my part. And I just wondered if people could kind of link kind of how they'd learned to express emotions or not in their kind of households growing up, and whether they could kind of link that to how they behaved as adults now, or what was happening for them now.
Yeah, it really interesting actually. I was just kind of making the link myself when you were talking, and I was like, oh, holy cow, like it's just kind of, completely spot on to kind of what I was saying earlier about the fact that I feel numbness right now, and I find it quite difficult to be able to put my finger, attach kind of like, or just feel emotion. And I think because the thing is I grew up in a hippie house, like it was full of people all the time, and it was kind of quite a shared kind of like living situation, community. But I always felt really lost within that. Like I didn't really know like who my parents really were. I thought I had like 1,000 of them really. And so I didn't really know who was my emotional rock, who was the person who looked after me emotionally, like was there any kind of I don't know, structure. And so what I did is like, instead of actually kind of talking about myself emotionally, I retreated into fantasy world, where I built kind of like, characters. Oh my God, this sounds nuts, doesn't it? But I built,
only a little bit nuts.
just a tiny bit nuts. But I built little worlds for myself, and like little imaginary friends where like I could, I don't know, not talk to or anything like that, but it was just kind of like a world where I could sort of be myself and maybe say or think whatever it was I wanted to feel. So maybe I just didn't necessarily learn how to express emotions.
Yeah.
And that's kind of really what's happening right now, is the fact that maybe I feel like completely overwhelmed, but I just, like I've done so much work on myself over the years, like I really, but it's still so relevant to kind of like my coping mechanisms to when I was younger.
It's kind of disappointing for me. It's always slightly disappointing. I always think, oh fuck, yeah, here I am. Here I am, 5 years old, feeling embarrassed for having emotions. Okay, sorry.
Definitely. It's very infantilizing sometimes. Like I feel that, oh my God, like absolutely. When you were talking earlier, Liz, I was like, oh my God, yeah, I'm just a kid. Like sometimes I'm just a kid.
Oh, I know what last week when we were talking about grief, one of the kind of I think one of the emotions that came up was sort of powerlessness, and which is a very sort of child position, as we know, isn't it? Like when we do TA and other sessions, that kind of position of feeling absolutely kind of powerless, of course, corresponds with patterns of behavior that we had as children.
Yeah, definitely. And definitely. And it's just like that's a great word. Like I feel slightly powerless right now. I feel like I am, it just feels kind of like slightly lost on me right now about how to, I don't know, just sort of connect with myself. It's very, very confusing time right now.
Anybody else want to say anything?
Yeah, I was so in my house, I don't even think I knew what emotions were until I was an adult. My mum used to display quite a lot of angry emotions, so I think that's all I sort of really was aware of, and my emotions kind of got shut down in that.
Yeah.
And so I never really I suppose I did experience emotions, but I didn't know what they were. They were just really uncomfortable, lots of uncomfortable feelings within inside me. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I was actually able to name stuff that actually I was feeling. And I think because of the way that sort of in my household, you know, kids were seen and not heard, we weren't allowed opinions, we weren't really allowed to talk unless we were spoke to. So growing up in that way made me sort of, I suppose, bury anything big that is happening and just be busy and get on with it, so that emotions don't actually have a chance to come into it.
I think that's an incredibly relevant point, Tonya, for lots of people, that in that correspondence between emotions and an uncomfortable feeling, you know, just like emotions blanket equals uncomfortable. Is, you know, quite, I think, experienced. Well, it is experienced by lots of people. And of course, you know, what people do with that is generally, you know, try to get rid of that discomfort without actually knowing what the feeling is or the emotion is, you know, like, oh, having uncomfortable feelings, what do I do with that?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like in the first sort of week of our lockdown, it was like a tsunami had sort of washed over my whole body. Of so much emotion, and it was, I probably, like, you know, really, 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 really strong. And I'm just so glad that I have worked on myself, and I think it was actually in the next project that I actually named emotions, and that I can now name them, and I'm really sort of in touch, not greatly in touch, you know, but I am in touch and I'm aware of what I'm feeling, which I find, which is really important to be able to name and process and look at.
The next project, which is now Psychology for Change, the course, yeah?
Yes, it is. A wonderful Psychology for Change.
I read also somebody just, you know, linking it to quite very specific feelings as well. Like I was reading something about somebody whose father, I think, was always promising them things, you know, like, oh, I'll bring you this, or, you know, I'll sort that out, or I'll take you to Disneyland, whatever. And actually, you know, none of these things happened. And I was reading that person just sort of felt really unable to express enthusiasm or excitement because they kind of knew that nothing would happen with it. And, you know, as an adult, really, really struggled to kind of get excited about the future just because of the things that happened in that family as a young child. So I don't think it's too, you know, I think the connection between our experiences as young children are, you know, very kind of relevant to those as adults. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to ask, unless anybody wants to say anything more about their household, anybody want to say anything more? No? Okay. The other thing I wanted to ask you all, and this is a kind of question. It is a question because it's got a question mark after it. What are emotions for? What's the point of emotions?
Good question.
Very good. Is it sort of like a pressure pot release, sort of? I don't know.
To alert you to something, to it's almost like to, if there's danger or if there's sadness, it's to alert you to a situation or something that's happening that could possibly that you have to react to.
Yeah.
I was going to say it's kind of similar, but to kind of connect you to your environment. I was thinking of this kind of idea of, you know, we were born to feel, you know, kind of our emotions are our birthright, and you know, why are we born to have them? Which is why it's such a good question. But there's something around feeling bonds of love with your kind of social group because your survival depended on it, feeling danger sometimes because, again, survival. So I wonder if there is some kind of survival element, but it also connects us to the world we live in some way.
Yeah, you're all a smart lot, aren't you?
We've had good training.
We can attest to that.
I guess as well, it's kind of like giving us like hints as to like responses. It's like, you know, being able to look at how we're feeling and respond to that and look at the reasons why we're feeling like that. So it's like, you know, like a kind of survival thing, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, I actually nearly drove myself mad over the weekend, kind of digging into this a bit. And, you know, like, it's really interesting that it feels like there's no sort of real definitive answer, you know, with lots of psychology. There are like different theories and different ideas, but nobody's ever come up with like, right, emotions, that's what they're for. You know, they're like the world we inhabit. There are just lots of different ways of understanding human responses, you know, which I think are a real testament to the complexity of humans. Although I was reading something about rats laughing, which is a bit disturbing. But you know, basically, and I don't want to get too tied up into the kind of, you know, sort of theories, because then it just sort of intellectualizes what actually we're experiencing. But sort of theories, basically, it seems to be that that a physiological response happens, an arousal happens to an event. So yes, something external, and then there's a sort of, the individual must identify the reason for this arousal and kind of label it as an emotion. So it's a bit like, I read lots of things where like you know, you encounter an angry rattlesnake, you know, your cognitive response is like, oh, rattlesnakes, frightening. You know, your emotion is fear. So there's lots of kind of discussions about rattlesnakes and bears, because I think there's quite a lot of American stuff I encountered, and so that you know, that was very much one description, one explanation of what emotions are for. As people have said, they are a way that humans experience the world and their response to it. Yeah, I think you probably said it slightly more eloquently than me, but anybody want to add any more on that? About the point of emotions? I think certainly I kind of grew up thinking, what's the fucking point of emotions? They just seem to be painful. But,
well, yeah, I mean, that's interesting because, yeah, I mean, I get the point of emotions, but actually there's, yeah, they can be so painful that sometimes we can just find ways in order to make sure that we don't feel.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think that is quite relevant at the moment, just to myself, and actually also to some people that I've been talking to as well, that right now, just as like some sort of survival, and if emotions are kind of connected to alerting you to danger or, you know, survival or anything like that, then sometimes just for short periods of time, that it isn't the worst thing in the world to be able to disconnect from your emotions as well, if it just gets you through a week where it's just been a bit crappy.
Well, it can't get, you know, I mean, I know that, Bob, you're going to talk about trauma, aren't you, in the next podcast? And I think there's that you know, that kind of like the idea of a physiological response, and actually people getting stuck in that is touched upon or talked about when you discuss trauma. You know, and the kind of the evolutionary kind of purpose of having emotions and responses to external, you know, not only threats, but, you know, the need to bond, that, as you kind of called it, the birthright of feelings. I feel like you're going to explore that a bit more, but I kind of wanted to pull it back a bit into just like, okay, well, what do we do with this stuff? Yeah. So Bex, actually, you just kind of touched on something that actually we find ways of protecting ourselves from feelings.
Yes, yeah, short term, long term, but yeah, we find our own kind of defenses around that. Yeah.
And I know that one of the sessions we want to do is around ego defense mechanisms, actually, which is a slightly, another way of understanding all this, isn't it? Because I feel like, lots of things we talk about on the courses that we run are different ways of understanding very similar experiences, and managing those things.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we ourselves as a group have discussed ego defense mechanisms a week or so ago, and it's just so relevant for right now. And it's really important to understand as well why and how we put up those defenses so we're able to recognize them, but also able to kind of be able to go, okay, that's okay for the time being, and you can always take action yourself if you feel that one of your defense mechanisms is just like, you're not able to kind of function properly. But if it's a short-term thing where you've got you like, for instance, right now, just kind of personalizing it again, just to give it some context, is I think the reason why I'm not feeling is because I'm defending myself, and I'm still able to get on with my day. Like, I'm still able to get on with my bits of work and my sewing and stuff like that. So I feel like, actually, yeah, okay, this right now, this isn't kind of like unwieldy. Like, I can actually manage this.
Well, I think, if we go back to this idea of kind of what are emotions for, and the brain, if you like, making sense of what the world around us, and kind of taking in information, and then kind of, thinking of a response to that. In a way, there's so much happening at the moment that it's not really surprising that people are feeling really overwhelmed. This is like
Definitely.
completely new experience for people. Like, my brain's never experienced anything like this before. I don't know about anybody else. Does that kind of resonate with people? That idea
Totally.
that, yeah.
Definitely.
If you think of our brains as kind of, we see a rattlesnake and we think, oh, rattlesnake, frightening, scary. Or no, we think, oh, rattlesnake, dangerous. Actually, we are actually experiencing things at the moment that we have no, prior experience or knowledge of. It just feels impossible to take in what's happening. I think for many people, myself included.
I would say as well, the fact that, the people that we're kind of talking to and as ourselves, we've gone through life possibly not having emotions because we've used substances to totally control them and to cut them off, like most of our lives.
Yeah.
So even experiencing them, it is kind of like new and kind of like scary, and overwhelming.
Yeah.
Because you're not used to them. You're used to taking a certain drug that makes you feel a certain way, and that's cool, But it's like now you don't have that control. You've just got these, like, you've got these raw emotions that you have to kind of like, deal with in such an extreme way as.
Yeah. No, that's totally brilliant. It's like totally where I want to get to, because the other thing I did is I kind of looked at lots of advice that was, happening. There's loads of stuff out there, and once again, that feels really overwhelming. It's like, I kind of Google COVID-19 mental health, and it just kind of comes up with like a load of stuff of advice and, looking after your mental health, and it all, I mean, of course, it needs to be kind of helpful to as many people as possible. But one of the things I noticed is, there's lots of sort of little videos with really chirpy music, like plinky plonky, plinky plonky, and a sort of calming voice. But also that it felt like the most common model that was being used was CBT. And I know we do a day on CBT on the course that I think is I hope is really helpful for people. But it felt to me, that if you think about one of the principles of CBT is, how we perceive events, and that perception is a kind of active process of, selecting information from our environment and organizing it and interpreting. Actually, kind of what's happening at the moment just overwhelms that model, I feel a bit. it's kind of, I don't know what I'm perceiving at the moment, because it's unknown. And add to that what Heather says about the newness of kind of emotions for people. I think it's kind of incredibly difficult. And the main advice sort of seemed to be about kind of recognizing that interrelationship between thoughts and feelings and behaviors, and the catch it, check it, change it approach, where you kind of catch yourself having a negative thought, you sort of check whether it's kind of real, and then you change it. I want to diminish the potential helpfulness for people, but it just felt a bit basic for me. I don't know if anybody has any feelings or thoughts on that.
I think that's such a good point. This whole kind of like how you think affects how you feel. Fine.
Yeah.
But what if you're thinking, like a million thoughts at the same time? How are you supposed to process your feelings?
Yeah. I mean, that was my kind of sort of, response to it. I was trying to kind of, I think I was angry, and I was like, oh, okay, why am I angry at little videos about CBT? There are other things to be angry about, Liz. But it felt like so basic that I just thought, Christ, this is going to be really hard. Anybody else have any kind of thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, like I really relate to that, and I think it links to what Heather was saying about like people with histories of substance abuse not well, for me personally anyway, I feel like I've got a very low tolerance level for feeling and emotions that are big, because yeah, like it goes back to what I was saying, that for some reason that's frightening. It probably connects to my childhood and things like that. But what I have found with CBT at certain points where I've like tried my hardest to sort of engage with it, is that I've been confronted with like that almost like a requirement to kind of like be willing to do things like modify my behavior or let go of what Bex was talking about, like shift what are like good self-defense mechanisms for me, like that with CBT I'm being asked to let them go in order to like open the floodgates to this massive feeling that I essentially don't want to feel, and it always has made me retreat a little bit or only get so far with CBT as like a form of therapy. And I have friends who've talked about dialectical behavioral therapy. I don't actually know much about it, but from them I understand that it is apparently a bit more helpful for people who don't respond so well for CBT.
Well, yes. I mean, I kind of dug into this a bit, and I think there's a much more emphasis with dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT. So I don't have to say that again and again. But I think there's much more emphasis on kind of sitting with emotion rather than changing the thought, and then you can change the feeling kind of thing. So it's kind of really interesting. I think the roots of it was developed by a woman called Marsha Linehan, and it sort of modifies CBT, but it brings in radical acceptance that's based on Buddhist practice. So I actually feel like it reading about it, it actually has, it's a model much closer to what we try to do with our courses, Psychology for Change and the Feminism for Change course, because actually the really key word here is dialectic, which anybody kind of have any suggestions for the kind of definition of dialectic? Just as a no. Anybody else?
This is where the virtual tumbleweed goes across the screen. Yeah.
Okay, dialect's one of my favourite words.
The meaning of what you're saying.
No. Well, does anybody has anybody come across the word dialectic before?
No.
I definitely have in Marxist left-wing political circles.
Yeah, good. I was hoping that. Well, I was assuming you had. Would you venture a definition?
Well, it's always a word that people use, and then no one is quite sure if anyone else in the room knows what the person is talking about. But,
Brilliant. So
something
should we just
about-
carry on talking about David? Okay, I assume everybody knows.
But I think something about a conversation, and maybe like there are contradictions that need to be worked through or worked out.
Totally, yeah. I mean, it's kind of, it's really helpful actually, and that we'll just define it. And it's a bit basic, but it kind of means trying to balance or synthesize, you know, bring together opposite positions that come together and work to progress onwards. You know, it's like it is the sort of yin and yang symbol thing. It's like, you know, those two opposites synthesize and make change happen. And in philosophy, it's the, you know, we won't go into that, but it's about how ideas change. But in dialectical behavioral therapy, you know, it's basically has these two parts. One of them is acceptance, so it's accepting who you are, and really interestingly, the other thing is change. So it sounds like those two things would be really opposites, like acceptance and change, but in what DBT, you know, attempts to do is kind of say to people, you are good enough, this is you, but you can change. And you know, there are huge similarities with the Serenity Prayer in Fellowship, and it's not that I've noted it, you know, it has been noted before by that, you know, God grant me serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change, and wisdom to change the things I can, and to know the difference. So in a way that, you know, it kind of encapsulates the approach of DBT. And I kind of feel like a lot of what we're trying to say in the courses that we run is, you know, to help people accept what happened to them, but actually to help people, and we use kind of psychology as a tool, I think, but, you know, to give people the techniques or the tools to be able to make change as well. Does that make sense to people?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it does.
Yeah, totally.
So in DBT, the acceptance, you know, what were called acceptance techniques, you know, the idea is that people learn to accept their emotions and learn also to kind of regulate them. Sounds a bit cold, doesn't it? But, you know, learn to kind of accept those emotions as emotions, and they're not good or bad or wrong, they just are these emotions, and actually to kind of understand ways of kind of managing those emotions rather than just changing them. And so the beginning of DBT is these acceptance techniques and helping people to understand themselves as a person and why they might have used drugs and alcohol. And I feel like this, you know, has a lot of resonance with what we do, because I think I feel like a lot of what we're saying to people is not like, oh, you were wrong to use drugs and alcohol, but actually, you know, why did you do those things? Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like, and I think what you were saying about how it links to maybe the 12-step kind of approach, or the Serenity Prayer, I also relate to, because I think a lot of the time people in the fellowship talk in that way about like getting your feelings back and learning, like in sobriety, I guess, learning that your emotions won't kill you. And that's kind of like the biggest fear that people have in addiction, I suppose, is that, like, really, that somehow these emotions are going to kill me, and I'd rather kill myself through drugs and alcohol.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think, you know, one of the first steps in DBT is to recognize that emotions are really intense and changeable, and it kind of goes back to Bob's kind of like, you know, I've experienced so many things in a day. And I mean, I've always been, you know, sort of slightly put off DBT because I was aware that it was developed as a way of working with what used to be called borderline personality disorder, which is interestingly now renamed emotionally unstable personality disorder. And, you know, that was kind of like repelled me a bit, because I just thought, oh, it's just I know, another label, man. But actually, you know, this idea of like emotional instability feels very relevant at the moment. And actually, you know, part of the kind of DBT was developed because it recognized that some people will have underlying vulnerabilities, such as a history of trauma and stress, that will mean they will react kind of so-called disproportionately to difficult events. And actually, it's about managing these so-called disproportionate emotional responses. And I kind of wondering whether, you know, people, Katie and Heather have touched upon this, that people who've used drugs and alcohol in the past to block out emotions will be really flooded with emotions that, you know, you could call disproportionate to events, although I'm not too sure about that. Does that make, this idea of kind of having a really high emotional response and to what's happening at the moment?
Yeah, very much so. Especially, yeah, totally. I would say as well, I mean, I think sometimes it can be, we're talking about emotions, like even naming them or kind of like knowing how you're feeling can be really difficult for some people. I mean, we've seen it in some of our mixed classes that some of the men in the class find it, you know, really difficult to even know how or what they're feeling, you know, because obviously, you know, being kind of like society saying that men shouldn't behave like, you know, in that certain way, and being able to kind of like know how you feel so that you can kind of act on that. You know, it can be quite difficult for people to kind of like identify, I guess, their emotions.
Yeah,
I think some things. Oh, sorry.
Go on, Bob.
I was just going to say something, you know, something that Bex talked about earlier, this feeling of numbness, because I think for a lot of people, you know, we're talking about how the feeling of emotions can feel overwhelming and terrifying. But I think for a lot of people, this idea of numbness can also feel really distressing. And I think like a lot of people don't really, I mean, you know, it's funny things, you know, is numbness an emotion, but, or, you know, a feeling. But I think, you know, in some ways it's less about that, but it's more about kind of saying, or more about the act of turning your attention inwards. And if numbness is what you discover, that's what you discover. I think there's something really important about the process of learning to kind of take your attention inwards rather than keeping it outwards, and then kind of having this very open space where any feeling, whether it's numbness or whether it's any of the other range of emotions, are valid.
Yeah, you know, I think it's a really great point. And yes, it is like, you know, there is no kind of the moral judgment on emotions, and no, you know, they are, I mean, it's very much about kind of sitting with your emotions, and that makes it sound incredibly easy, doesn't it? But actually, you know, we need emotions, not just the positive ones. And you know, that relationship with your emotions, and even if they are numbness.
And yeah, I would like to, you know, add to that this is like really normalizing stuff for me. And, you know, I think that was a really great point, Bob, because actually, I have, you know, I have an awareness of psychology. I have an awareness of my own feelings, how I react to it, how I respond to stuff in situations, my thoughts, feelings, and behaviors around stuff when it gets difficult. So I have, like, you know, looked inwards, and, you know, especially now, instead of going, oh my God, I don't feel anything, this is, you know, oh, it's just really awful and terrifying. I'm thinking, okay, well, actually, this is a relatively okay response to kind of what I'm personally, you know, going through right now. And I think normalizing that is a good thing.
Yeah, I think, you know, like when I started kind of looking into facilitating this session, you know, my kind of natural instinct was to want to come up with a solution for people, to like, well, so this is what you do, all these overwhelming emotions, and there you go, be all right, you'll be sorted. And actually, kind of the deeper I got into it, you know what, I just kind of thought it's about kind of normalizing and recognizing that we as humans have never experienced anything like this before, and as people that have experienced trauma in our past, and I'll talk about us as a team and the people we work with, actually, you know, numbness might be an emotional response, and that's okay. that is, that is a response. And
it's a response and it serves a purpose.
yes, absolutely. Yeah. And to be, once again, it makes it sound a bit easy, but to sort of be okay with that. And actually just sort of, we talk a lot about developing vocabulary and language, don't we? And I know on sort of sessions that I train, I've talked before about where, as a young woman, certainly I had no language for how I was feeling other than shit or great. And that was pretty much, I was like either shit or great. And actually, I think, getting to know myself more, I just very slowly and finding more words to describe what shit means. Shit might be frustrated, or shit might be disappointed. There are kind of nuances, there are kind of more language to describe those emotions. Is that kind of an experience of other people in developing a vocabulary of emotion?
Yeah, for me it has been. Like, as I said before, just the naming certain emotions. I think I was quite an angry child, but that anger was due to wanting a mother figure and a family, I suppose. I was angry that I never had that, and so I could name these feelings, which were really kind of great, and which has like really helped me because I'm a mum now as well. So it's sort of really shown me how important it is to allow children to display their emotions and not to be scared of them, whether they're angry, sad, or frustrated, or happy. It's so important to sort of be able to name them and know what they are and not be afraid of them.
Yeah. We talked, I mean, when Heather was talking earlier, not Heather, sorry, it was Katie, you were talking about, being afraid of having the sad feeling. It did sort of, it did remind me of the discussion we had about grief and anticipatory grief. And I think with feelings, a lot of people's kind of anxiety is around anticipating feelings. I am frightened of what feeling sad will be, or I am frightened of being angry because it will consume me. So there is very much a kind of sense of, making friends with your emotions and recognizing what they are, but also their usefulness. I think it's, really helpful and important. One of the things I want that we attach to this podcast is a feelings wheel, and there's quite a few of them out there, rather confusingly. But I for those of you who don't know, this is a kind of a way of helping people to go beyond like feeling angry. Well, is that feeling frustrated? Is that feeling annoyed? Is that feeling numb? There will be a root emotion behind the emotions we recognize as, if we recognize them as feeling. That wasn't where I all put, sorry, but there'll be a feelings wheel attached to the handout that accompanies this session.
That's great. They're really useful.
I think so. I think, it took me like a long time to realize that when I was feeling bored, like, so we're like, oh, I'm bored. Actually, I was really sad. Bored was just a name I called. It was more acceptable name I called, an emotion. But actually, I was feeling frightened a lot of the time. I wasn't bored. I was frightened, and feeling bad. Does that make sense to people as well?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I've seen that wheel thing, and it is brilliant because it's like if you haven't got the words or you don't know, to actually be able to kind of say, yeah, that's it. That's exactly what it is, rather than, and put it down sort of precisely, rather than, like you said, having this sort of vague feeling and not quite sure what it is or how to kind of explain it or name it.
I think, you know, I mean, we're coming to the end now, and I don't want to get too into it, but one of the other interesting things about DBT that I got really interested in was how they kind of basically identify 8 primary emotions, which are anger, sorrow, joy, fear, disgust, guilt, shame, interest, and surprise. And actually, kind of basically, they sort of say you're hardwired basically with these basic emotions, and you can sort of see the crossover in that kind of that those theories about evolutionary emotional responses being there to kind of, you know, help us survive as humans. So it sort of basically goes, you've got all these kind of basic emotions, but on top of that, there are emotions, there are kind of what they call secondary emotions, and these are learned from our environment, so our families early on, so that often people feel shame when they're angry or feel fear when they're angry, so that, you know, it's that kind of really confusing, you know, emotional responses, are what DBT calls secondary kind of emotional responses. And I think that's where lots of people really struggle. So they kind of, you know, they're feeling shame, and actually they don't really understand where that comes from. So both this idea of kind of, you know, understand emotions, and you might use an emotional kind of wheel for that, I think is really helpful.
So are you saying that there's like feelings we pick up that are not ours, and we have to kind of disentangle between stuff we've picked up on the way from our parents and things in our childhood?
Yes, I am, and I think that's that cuts across a lot of like different theories that we
Yeah, it's
can talk about.
fascinating.
Yeah, because, you know, think about if we think about, yeah, I mean, you know, without going into my family again, but, you know, so much of my kind of emotional response to the world I can see in my mother, you know, my sister, and, you know, and learning not to kind of express emotions like Tanya's talked about, and not knowing what those emotions are. But, you know, that feel like Tanya sort of talked about her mum being really angry and aggressive, and you being an angry child as well. So, you know, are they your emotions?
Yeah, no, I totally really get that. And then I sort of yeah, we sort of do a set emotions thing secondary in feminism as well.
Okay.
We have something on one of our slides. I think it may be relationship with self. I'll have to have a look, but it does talk. It's just a little box of emotions and then a secondary emotion that may accompany that. But I didn't know that that was picked up from childhood, and it makes so much sense.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? I mean, it's anyway, it's kind of simple, like, yeah, of course, you know, like you are this little sort of sponge, and a lot of you know, one of the things that comes out a lot on attachment theory, and I know we're going to do another session on this, is that for a lot of people with anxious attachment, they grew up kind of anticipating the emotions of their parents, or having to manage those emotions of their parents, or caregiver, because, you know, the caregiver was not able to contain them. You know, that cuts across lots of kind of theories about this idea that your primary caregiver, you know, you need to feel, as a young child, you need to feel contained and safe. Well, of course, lots of people don't, and it's not because their caregivers are evil, horrible people. It's just that they grew up not being able to, you know, feel contained, and so on. So that I know for lots of people with trained, this idea that they were constantly anticipating the emotions of their caregiver, you know, and trying to read their faces for how that caregiver would be responding to situations, seems to be quite a common experience for people.
I guess there's also something about they mirror the emotions of the caregiver. Is
Yeah,
there like I should probably read more about this, but I think there's just something about like we mirror, because again, I think it's a child's way of connecting.
totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know,
But then it's confusing because then you're mirroring emotions just because you feel the need to do it because your survival depends on it. But like as you were saying, as you grow up, you find yourself with loads of kind of emotional responses that aren't actually yours.
Yeah. God, I think we probably need to, and then you put that in a situation like now, where you know it's almost like so overwhelming. Well, it is overwhelming. It's not so, you know, it's not like overwhelming. It is overwhelming what's happening. So, how people will be able to kind of, you know, just kind of recognize their emotional responses and challenge it and move on seems pretty tough to me at the moment. Yeah. So, I think, do you know what? I kind of, as I started off saying at the beginning of this, where, you know, like taking a kind of subject like, you know, emotions, overwhelming emotions, felt so kind of, it's in itself, it felt so huge. And there were very different, there were different sort of avenues to go down this. And one of them, you know, was the physiological kind of responses to what's going on. The other was how we are managing to cope with that Bex talked about, ego defense mechanisms, and you know, if you think of the ego as the self, you know, the self is just trying to survive in all this. And then there is the stuff we touched upon with TB, which is much about kind of learning to be with your emotions and accepting those emotions and finding ways of kind of, you know, sort of working with them helpfully, I think is probably a good way of putting it, rather than just changing them. You know, it's actually kind of recognizing that you're having these emotions, which is going to be pretty tough, I think, for people. But you know, there are so many facets to the idea of emotions and what they are, and there is no definitive, you know, there is no definitive understanding of what emotions are. Do you know what? Right now, I'm feeling like Donald Trump reading a press conference. I feel like thinking about
You're not angry
emotions has made, no, I know, but thinking about emotions has made my brain die in bits that is only replicated in watching Trump. So, yeah, anyway. And that's all I can say. other than I'm doing bigly well and I'm really on top of this, and yeah, I think I'm doing great. Yeah.
The best I've ever done.
Yeah. We're on top of these emotions, people.
Thanks.
Thank you, Liz.
Okay.
Thanks, that was great.
Thanks very much.